So perhaps to be able to respond to your topics, let me start by sharing with you a story. No doubt, Chris, you've heard of the story plenty of times, so my apologies for the repeat and the boredom that will visit you. The three of you will be fine, hopefully. This story contains everything in life, everything. Whether you are a politician or a religious figure, how you read a book, how you write a book, how you think thoughts, how you experience life. So the story is very, 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 very rich. And if you have some experience that has birthed a good amount of maturity inside you, maturity in thinking, maturity in feeling, maturity in having your feelings go through your intellect so that they could become more refined, that when you try to express the things that you're thinking about and the things you're feeling about, you can express them clearly and making sure that they don't contain very many fallacies. And even if you find that throughout our today's class, my interpretation of the story or telling of the story is somewhat crude, incomplete, remember the story, memorize it, take it home, and keep playing with it. And it's kind of like a dough, you know, it's like clay. Play with it until you can get it right for yourself. And if by chance my interpretation is something that you enjoy, again, take the story home and parts of my interpretation, because you can't remember all of it, the parts that you do remember, work on those parts to make it better so that it can fit you, your psychology, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, the sort of experiences you've had in your life, and the things you want to understand about life and about yourself. So the story involves a king moth. You guys all know what moths are? These ridiculously large flies or butterflies. And you know what a king is symbolic for. King has a lot of power. What the king says goes. You just hope to God, pray to God that the king that is at least strong to be a relatively good shepherd is a relatively decent fellow. So he doesn't betray you, he doesn't deceive you, he doesn't create difficulties in your life and burdens you even further. So that's what a king is, someone with a tremendous amount of power. For the longest time in our human history, kings were looked upon something like Jesus Christ. Okay, they had God inside them, and because human beings usually desire justice and decency and truth and equality and fairness, human beings don't usually have those qualities about them. So you want someone in whom God has truly risen. Okay? If you want to see God, you have to go through me, for example. That there is something about Jesus Christ, about Buddha, about Muhammad. When you see them, you see divine attributes and divine qualities. So naturally, all of us in this class, we desire justice, we desire truth, we desire nobility, decency, meaning, purpose. And all of us want to look ourselves in the mirror and not experience too much shame or embarrassment because of the way we live life. Okay? And whenever you're looking for someone to teach you anything, what you're really seeking is someone who's very, very proficient, someone who's been there, who's done that, experience has seasoned and matured them. What you're looking for really is God, someone who knows everything about this craft, or as much as possible, all right? You also have a regular moth. A common moth, a moth who lives an ordinary life, But there is something about moths that you need to understand, which is to some extent the nature of all human beings. Moths desire to be near light, near fire. Okay? And it's something that is innate in them. In other words, the moment a moth is born, there is something about the psychology of the moth that says, when you see the sun, when you see light, when you see fire, just fly towards it. And then, of course, there is fire. Should you go to Yosemite this winter when the snow has packed the ground and it's freezing temperature, hopefully you have purchased some firewood from Oakland, or you have stolen some from Lucky's. You put them in your trunk and you go to you go to Yosemite. You put up your tent, and 7, 8, 9, 10 in the morning when you wake up, you say, I should make some omelet. And you make a fire. That's one reason as to why you make a fire. The other reason is it's dark, the sun is out, you can't see anything, and your only chance of seeing what's around you is either a flashlight or fire. Now, light in this particular story is symbolic for I can kind of look out there and see what's around me. There is a board, there's the wall, there's a projector, computers. A few of us sitting in this classroom. It's quite light. I have access because of my senses. But psychologically, when you ask, what is an extrovert? What is an introvert? Well, I could ask you, well, why don't you turn on your flashlight and look for yourself? And you say, what are you talking about? What light? And even if I was to become interested in figuring out what an extrovert or an introvert are, I wouldn't really know how to start doing this. I don't know where to go. And even if I was to see it, I wouldn't recognize it. And when you ask a question about fallacies, how do we recognize them? How do we fix them? How do we avoid them? What you're asking is, can you give me some light? Can you enlighten me? So light in this particular story becomes a psychological component that we assume that we know. And we assume that we know where we're going, what we're doing. We assume to know who we are, what we are. And time passes and we realize we've made a lot of mistakes and we have no clue who we are, what we've done, where we're going. Okay? So remember, light becomes symbolic of a good amount of darkness, not only being outside of you, but also on the inside. So naturally, we gravitate towards light so that we can see. Just to season this last part of the story, or the component being light, there was a philosopher a long time ago, going back to Chris's question as to why good philosophers never write, and if they do, they hide their intentions and their wisdom in words that have so many different layers, and they leave their wisdom to the ears that can hear and the eyes that can see. They're not just going to come out and say, well, here's the truth and here's my wisdom. They never say that. First, because wisdom and truth can't really be spoken directly. Second, There is a saying in the Middle East that truth has a tendency of protecting itself, that wisdom will never allow anyone who's contaminated, okay, to get close to it, to touch it, to contaminate it. Diogenes was one of those philosophers who create all sorts of deceptions for his people. First, he dressed really, really bad. You've dressed nicely today, Julian. Combed your hair, washed your face, shaved. And then you'll go around the lake today, and a young woman or a young man will look at you and say, wow. And that's the illusion you create for others. That they assume that because you dress well, you know what beauty is. You know what attraction is. And not only do you look attractive on the outside, surely you must also have possession to this thing called beauty on the inside. So your soul is beautiful, which means that you have been touched by God. Diogenes knew too well human tendencies and foibles, so he never shaved. His hair was long, he never showered, he smelled bad all the time. He didn't talk to anybody. He was like the Sufi mystic Uwais Qarani. When Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, told two of his people to go look for Uwais, they said, Uwais, who's Uwais? We've never seen Uwais. We've never heard of this man. Where does he live? And Muhammad tells them, go to the city called Qaran. He's there, look for him. But why hasn't he come to see you? And Muhammad says, because he has a mother who's old and blind and sick. Even though he may want to come here, he'd rather stay home and take care of his mom. So go seek him out. And so they go to the city and they ask, do you guys know where Uwais is? And the people tell these two folks, Ali and Omar, that why do you seek him out? He's a very strange man. When people laugh, he sits and cries. When people cry, he sits and laughs. When people are walking around, he never leaves his house. When people are staying in their house, he comes out and walks. Why do you seek him out? So Diogenes, who is one of the founders of the Cynic school, and you need to understand what cynicism is. A cynic is, to some extent, wrongly put, of course, but it could be really both an introvert or an extrovert. A cynic is someone who looks around and doesn't see very many good things. Do you have children, Julian? Of course not, thank God, you're far too young. Sometimes I go back to the time that I was born. There was no internet, no cell phones, no credit cards. Nobody really had cars. You had to walk to wherever you wanted to go. We only had 2 TV channels. Both had to do with politics. On Fridays only, we could watch cartoons from 4 until 6. The rest was politics and religion. There were no Western movies. And even, I remember when there was a movie that had just came to Iran on TV, black and white, and this man and this woman kissed. And we would turn to our parents and say, are they married? They're kissing. And my parents, of course, to protect our naivete and innocence, they would say, oh no, they have this mask on their lips. So when their lips touch, they can't really feel one another's body or skin. And you would go in the streets after school from 2 in the afternoon until about 8 and play soccer, run around, get into fights, and then go back home. Parents would smack you, slap you, kick you, to educate you, not to lie, not to cheat, not to do things that are harmful to yourself or other people. And of course, time changed. And like Abraham in Genesis, where God tells him, go out there, leave your parents and make your own life. I eventually left my parents and made my own life and then had children. Everywhere we go, everyone is glued to a cell phone. No one talks to anyone. We went to Roseville this past weekend to visit my parents. We went to the mall. The way people dress, the way they look. And if you happen to be a relatively decent parent, you say, oh my God, I'm going to protect my kids from all this trash. For those of you who know this man, he's a Native American, Chief Seattle. One of his complaints about the incoming culture, the white culture, was that, the red man, he argued, walks, runs, hunts. He's always active with his body. And he's always active with his emotions. He's always active with his intellect. But the white man just sits. And when he walks, he's not really conscious or aware of his body. He assumes that his body is only there to carry his head. And when you sit down with the white man to talk to him about life, you realize that there is nothing in his head that's valuable, you see. Cynicism is when you look around you and you say, how the hell am I going to be able to protect any decency, any amount of innocence that I still have inside me? It's like when you know that a tsunami is coming your way and you say, well, my house is gone, my car is gone, everything that I have built so far is going to go away because of the force of the tsunami. And though today, of course, cynicism is frowned upon, it's a very realistic way of looking at life. It's like being a Sigmund Freud, where you see a lot of darkness and only a little bit of light. Diogenes was like that. He has little appreciation for Plato in his writing. Plato, from what little I have read, lived a relatively lavish lifestyle, and Diogenes would simply go into his environment and just be dirty, be muddy, and step on his rug, jump on his pillows. And when Plato would ask him, what are you doing? You're dirtying my house. Diogenes would look at Plato and says, no, I'm not jumping on Plato's pillows. I am jumping on Plato's vanity. Do you see? So Diogenes used to walk around with a lit lantern, but not at night, only when the sun was out, like today. And you would go out there and say, Diogenes, why are you wasting oil? There is no gas, there are no batteries way back then. And he would say, there is too much darkness around me. I'm carrying this lit lantern to see what's in front of me. And then, of course, that story of Diogenes reaches the mind and the hands of someone like Nietzsche in the 19th century. This time, Diogenes just throws the lantern down, shatters it, and says, no, I have come too early. I don't think these people know what they have done. that they live in so much darkness, and yet they assume that there is so much light around them. So going back to the moth story, the king one day walks on his balcony and says, I am seeking 4 brave moths. And since everybody wants to impress the king, 20 come forth. And the king begins to ask them some very, very difficult questions. And eventually the king picks only 4. And he looks at the 4 and says, each of you is going to go on a journey. And the moths begin to ask, what journey? You're going to go in search of fire. Once you find it, you need to come back and report to the rest of us what fire is like. What is fire? What is truth? What is decency? What does it mean to be a human being? As Chris would say, what does it mean to be a philosopher? What does it mean to be a Jesus Christ? What does it mean to be a Malcolm X or a Mahatma Gandhi? And each of these moths say, okay, and remember, not only do they want to impress the king, they also want to create a report that's clear, concise, so they can speech it to their people. The first one goes on this quest. There is also another thing that you should consider. You see the journey that's being taken by every moth. First, they're doing it because they want to please the king. Remember who and what the king is. Should any of you in this class desire to go on a quest, on a journey, make sure that quest, the desire for the quest, is given to you by someone who has mature qualities inside them. If your father says go to school, obey his wishes. If your mother says dump the trash, obey her wishes. If your mom says clean the house with me, do as she says. These are seasoned human beings who have worked 8 hours, they've come home, they've cooked, they've cleaned, now they're exhausted. And what is it that they demand of you, request of you? Can you take out the trash? That's not your desire, but it's your mom's. And it'll benefit you if you say, okay. So remember, never pursue your own desires because you're unseasoned. Never pursue the desires of those who are below you, because they can't think well. They can't feel well. They can't see well. They lack the proper experiences. Okay? So when you read, for example, the Bible and Jesus says, first seek the kingdom of God, sit back, reflect, contemplate. Is he right? Could he unburden you? Is he a seasoned man? When you read the Bible, is it filled with rubbish or is it filled with insight? If it is, consider him to be your king. Read the dialogues of Plato. Is he a seasoned man? Is he right in suggesting that philosophy, the only thing it really does and should do is to prepare the human being to die well? Is Socrates saying something ridiculous, childish? Or is there some maturity, seasoned experience, some divine attributes inside Socrates that push him to say those things? How do you die well? You die well if you're able to live well. Well, how the hell do you live well? Because life is nothing but a set of desires. If that's the case, what sort of desire should live inside you? What sort of desire should you follow and pursue? So in many ways, you should consider the 4 moths who have volunteered to go on this journey. Consider them to be profoundly lucky. They're not listening to their moms. They're not listening to their dads. They're not listening to social media. They're not listening to their instructors. They're listening to the king moth, who's a good shepherd of his people. The first one goes on this long journey, comes back after 5 months. The king is very, very happy to see him and says to the moth, well, tell us. Fire, it illuminates its surrounding. If this was a class that was held from 6 in the evening till 9, and if I was to turn off the lights, none of us in this class could see anything. But the moment I turn on the lights, now you can see tables and chairs, where you want to sit, how you should maneuver your body so you don't bang it to this and that. It is true that fire illuminates its surrounding. And the king asks this moth, is there anything else? And the moth says, no. The king looks at the moth and says, it's good, but it's incomplete. Do you know what happens when you try to please someone and he or she tells you, thank you, but you haven't really done a good job? If you happen to be a very immature, egocentric human being, you'll get really, really upset because the king has embarrassed you, and he has embarrassed you in front of all of your people. And because of the element of pride that lives in all of us, this moth takes offense to the comments of the king. But because he knows his place relatively well, he doesn't say anything. If you read the Gospel of Judas, that's exactly what you get. Jesus is the only disciple in this particular gospel who never looks at Jesus in the eyes. Because Judas knows he is only a mere mortal, whereas Jesus is God. And Judas says, man cannot look at the face of God. Man is filled with toxins. He is contaminated. He has no right to look at Jesus. He should always keep his head down and his eyes lowered. That's the only way you're able to respect divinity. Just to give him your ears, but don't look at him. See? If that's a little difficult for you to grasp, imagine that your mom has caught you doing something that you shouldn't have done. You're not going to look into her eyes. Your head will be lowered. And you just nod your head. Yes, Mom. I'm sorry, Mom. You're right, Mom. I'll never do it again, Mom. You understand your place. You understand your position. But the moth does something really, really, really interesting. Because the moth has this poison called pride inside him. He says, I went on this journey. 5 months I sacrificed my life. My time, my energy, not seeing my kids, not seeing my wife or husband, my parents. Got 5 months off of my work. I know what fire is. It illuminates its surroundings. So you know what I'm going to do? The king may be right, but I'm going to write my experiences in a book. And then I'm going to publish it. And it's going to go on Amazon. And people are going to buy it. And they'll say great things about the book. And the book is written, and the book gets published, and it sells 50 million copies. And do you know what happens when people begin to read books? They will assume that what the author is saying is actually quite accurate. And now everybody now walks around saying, fire illuminates its surrounding. And you realize that fire, who has all these wonderful qualities, gets limited, gets boxed, caged. Fire only illuminates its surrounding. That's all it does. So when you guys read a book in this class, inside you is born a set of emotions, and those emotions eventually give birth to a belief system. And that belief system makes you who you are. It makes you rigid. It makes you a bigot. You're filled with prejudice, bias. But you can't do much. A belief system is like a concrete that was once soft when you poured it. Then it sits for 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks. And it's 6 inches thick with rebars everywhere. And it just takes one of those gigantic jackhammers to break it apart. So beware of belief systems. They may give you identity, but they also steal your soul. The second moth goes away, and he's on this quest for 2 years, and comes back and looks at the king and says, "It is true that fire illuminates its surrounding." Oh, it's okay. It's true that fire illuminates its surrounding, but it also generates heat. 50 million copies of fire has been sold, and in all these copies, people know only one thing, and they believe in it wholeheartedly. Fire only illuminates. Now you have an added component. It also generates heat. Do you know what that means? It means that those who are receptive, who have the capacity to accept this added component, have to struggle surviving and convincing the group of people who only believe that fire only illuminates. So when you go on a quest for 5 months, you only have access to one piece of knowledge. When you go on a quest for 2 years, you have access to 2 pieces of knowledge. Fire illuminates, it's also hot. Do you know what happens when someone tells you fire is hot, in addition to it lighting the environment? It means that just in case you're cold, just in case your child, very much like mine, is suffering from flu, and is always shivering. Place him close to the fire. It'll heat up his body. He'll heal quicker. Just in case you have food and you want to warm your food, fire will become handy. And all of a sudden you realize that the more you know about fire, the more utility it can have. See, when you say that fire only illuminates, you have this great fallacy in your argument. Especially if that particular statement becomes a foundation for a whole host of other statements.